Hello and welcome to Eye on Africa here on France 24. I'm Clarisse Fortuné. First, the headlines. A country marked by widespread cycles of violence. A peace agreement was signed in South Sudan in 2020. But today, the UN denounces extrajudicial killings, ethnic violence and repression. After recent promises of jobs opportunities in Spain, thousands of Gambians rushed to apply, but many are now disillusioned after reports of nepotism and unclear wage expectations. King Mohammed VI urges Moroccans not to perform the Muslim rite of slaughtering sheep during Eid al-Adha this year. 7 years of drought have led to a sharp drop in the country's herd. And we start in South Sudan. 14 years after its independence, the country remains caught in a web of conflict, impunity and human rights abuses with no functioning rule of law. That's one of the conclusions of a new UN report on the situation in the country. With me now is Yasmin Sooka. She's joining us from the UN Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan, and she's also one of the co-authors of this report. Welcome. For joining us. This is a damning report denouncing widespread cycles of violence, corruption, repression happening all over the country, including in Warab State. So what's the situation there?
Well, in Warab State particularly, the situation is devastating, actually. There's such a state of lawlessness, mainly because you have no real judicial system. You have one judge for 6 counties and you have one court. And so what state authorities have done is they have passed emergency legislation called the Green Book legislation. And if you commit a crime, whether you're stealing a loaf of bread or you're involved in, a very serious crime, what the authorities do is they arrest and detain you, they hand you over to a firing squad who shoot you in a public square, and there is no due process, no trial. And in fact, what you've seen is the appropriation of authority to these leaders who are really unaccountable to anybody. And of course, as the Green Book has been used to target particular ethnic groups, this is really beginning to be a cause of grave concern. This is apart from the fact that in Warab State, you have, I think, an increase in conflict-related sexual violence. You have young girls who have been raped, who have no recourse to any access to justice or medical support. And you have many young girls who are forcibly married off to much older men who can pay the dowry of cattle. And even when these girls are mistreated, they are unable to return to their families because nobody is going to give the cows back. And so women and girls have really been commodified in a transactional way in Warab, which is much the same as in the rest of the country.
And just to remind our viewers, officially the country is governed by a coalition formed by leaders of former warring agreements, of former warring factions, Salva Kiir and Machar. That was part of a peace agreement after 7 years of conflict. And yet your report also mentioned politically motivated conflicts, including in Western Equatoria.
Yes, I mean, the parties to the agreement requested another extension to the revitalized agreement. This is the 4th one. And in fact, the new transitional period started on the 22nd of February. And the reason that the government claimed they needed the extension was because they didn't have the financial resources to implement key provisions in the agreement. Now, as we speak, in the last 2 weeks, you've seen political violence break out between the two supporters of the two groups. In fact, Riek Machar has written a letter to the president asking for a meeting because there was a skirmish between IO troops and government forces in which more than a dozen of them were killed and 80,000 people displaced. And given the kind of violence that has taken place in the last week, the African Union mission in South Sudan IGAD, the regional authority, UNMISS, the peacekeeping mission, have all written to both parties asking them to de-escalate the violence and, of course, ensure that in this extension period, they will implement the outstanding provisions of the peace agreement. These outstanding provisions, of course, relate to the unification of forces. Right now, you have many different armed factions, and in fact, under different commanders. And it was one of the key provisions in the peace agreement that these forces should be unified so that you would have one army for South Sudan. And, since 2016, this has not been done, and that remains a key risk for the country. You also haven't seen the passing of legislation to set up a permanent constitution, which would really reflect the values and the social contract between the people of Sudan and the government. And, that should form the basis for elections and the election of a democratic government, because these are, after all, unelected leaders who really came out of the bush and fighting to sign an agreement, and is responsible really for the political competition that is fueling the violence in the country.
And Yasmin, on top of that, we have to talk about the neighboring country, Sudan, which is in the middle of similar conflicts. So do you think does it already have an impact? And also, do you think it might spill over the whole region?
I think that there's a real risk to the Horn of Africa, and we can't think about the conflict in one particular country. I think that Sudan is already having an impact on South Sudan. In Sudan, you now have parallel governments, one for the RSF and one for SAF, which is based in Port Sudan. And what you're already beginning to see is the recruitment of Southerners from South Sudan to go and fight for either one of these factions. You also are seeing a proliferation of weapons because the borders are fairly porous. And you also have more than 1 million refugees having come from Sudan into South Sudan. And so I think that, the African Union and the regional authorities are going to really need to look at this question of how the conflict is affecting all of the neighboring countries in the region, because I don't think we can talk about, a one-country conflict anymore. I think we have to be very careful to make sure that it doesn't spill over into the rest of the region. And I think you're already seeing signs of that in South Sudan.
Yasmin Sooka, thank you very much for your analysis, a very worrying report there. Yasmin Sooka, she's from the UN Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan.